Hello, this is John from Samples to Symphonies. Muse's free MuseScore Studio version 4, playing back Muse's free Musesounds, produces full, warm orchestral textures from digital scores. You can perform large-scale pieces with Muse's help, and it costs you nothing. Why are they so generous? Giving away a gateway to your ecosystem is a well-trodden path for turning explorers into consumers. In many sectors, not just music and music education, once people have invested their time in learning and using the gateway product, in this case a way of working with music notation, they have reason to use complementary products. Notably, Muse own Hal Leonard, the world's largest sheet music publisher, but they offer other products and services too. For us users of MuseScore, they offer plugins through Muse Hub, including sample libraries made famous by their use in digital audio workstations. We can buy and install these libraries and use them alongside the free samples. Muse are hoping we notators will go the same route as many DAW-based composers and performers and become instrument collectors, hopefully completists. And they make it easier for skinflints who have only paid $0 for the platform, MuseScore Studio, by selling Musesounds versions of those libraries cheaply. But have they underestimated our miserliness? Maybe I should just say my miserliness. The free library is nice, thank you very much Muse, so why should I spend extra for these others? And if I'm going to buy one or two, which should they be? The reviews on MuseHub itself are mixed. Even once you have extra libraries, I've bought Cinesamples, Berlin and Spitfire orchestras, how do you decide what's best to use when? In 3 or 4 videos, maybe more if there's interest, I'm going to share what I've discovered about the strengths and weaknesses of the alternatives. First up, a music-driven approach. Let's start with a real piece of music and try to get the best out of each orchestra. We'll hear the test piece many times. Luckily, it's by Beethoven. I'll put timestamps in the description so you can find each demo quickly. The excerpt we're going to use is from the 5th movement of Beethoven's 6th Symphony, the Pastoral. I entered it myself and so far as I can tell it matches the printed score exactly, except I've added a few starting dynamics. What can we expect to test with this sample? First, there are solos in the woodwind and horns. That will allow us to hear and balance those individual instruments. Next, there's dynamics from piano to fortissimo with some sforzandos too. Then there are the repeated notes in the strings in the gorgeous chords in the second half. These will test if the sample libraries sound robotically uniform. Humanizing repeated notes and tremolos is for another video, but sample libraries differ in how badly they rat-a-tat or machine gun when faced with repetitions. What this sample doesn't test is percussion, and it has limited use of brass outside of the French horns. As a classical era orchestra, I'm using single instrument samples for all the brass. For later pieces, I sometimes use sample recordings of multiple trumpets or multiple trombones. When we load up the free Musesounds, this is what plays back. The mixer faders were all set flat at 0 dBs. Obviously that needs adjustment. Before we go there, let's hear exactly the same score played by Cinesamples, Berlin and Spitfire, again with flat faders. We need to adjust the mixer for all the libraries. There are some standout anomalies. You can hardly hear the oboe on Cinesamples, while the Spitfire bassoon is far too loud. Adjusting all the mixer faders to balance instrument volumes gives a new set of results. I've also adjusted some reverbs. So here's the 4 orchestras rebalanced, showing the mixer. We want to set the faders once and for all per piece. Then we adjust the moment-by-moment instrument loudness and tone through dynamics. There are at least 6 bass dynamics levels: pianissimo or PP, piano or P, mezzo piano MP, mezzo forte MF, forte F, fortissimo FF. You can certainly notate extensions of the range to PPP and FFF, but it's not clear that Musesounds actually plays them any differently from pianissimo and fortissimo. On top of the bass levels are the individual note stress effects of articulations like accents and marcato. Compared with a DAW, where you have continuous control of 128 levels of dynamics through a modulation wheel, it seems we're quite impoverished. You can visit intermediate dynamic levels, but only when you're travelling from one to another of the bass levels. For example, if you put MP, then a crescendo hairpin leading to MF, you go through the levels in between, but you can't stay on them. But when you hear a good orchestration play back, you realise that having just 6 bass dynamic levels isn't a limitation in practice. And Musesounds have done a good job of balancing the dynamics across instruments and libraries, except when it comes to this palette of surprises. Sometimes, for example, staccatos or tenutos will not match the volume level of ordinary sustain or legato playing. And although the interpretation of accents in an orchestra depend on the players listening to each other and calibrating for the particular arrangement, it does seem that in general accents are too heavy. Here's a snippet from Grieg's Morning, where I've adjusted the mixer but not made any dynamics changes. You can hear for all the libraries how the accents are overdone, and for some how instruments get out of balance as the volume level changes. The upshot of all this is you have to go in and redo dynamics and articulations. This is tedious. The only upside is you can think about how you'll eventually bring your personal interpretation. Those humanizing and interpreting nuances will be less extreme than the things you have to do just to get a reasonable balance. And what that means is that the only fair comparison between sample libraries is when you have individually corrected each one's dynamics and articulations to be a reasonable balanced mix at every level. A really important aspect of articulation is whether the instrumentalist plays successive notes with separate bow strokes, or separately tongued on a wind instrument, or whether they play them with a single bow or tongue action. That's noted with phrase marks or slurs. Here's the very start of the pastoral snippet. Viola and cello start up at the same time. The viola's notes are slurred, so they're going to be played with a single bow and are going to sound legato. The cello's notes aren't slurred because they're repeated. If they were too legato, they'd mush together. In fact, that is how it sounds at present, because MuseScore, for some unknown reason, doesn't interpret phrase marks by default. You have to turn it on like this with stave text, then select classic phrasing. Now our cello will play properly. We need classic phrasing for other instruments too. Now turning it on for the horn, and now for the flute, and it doesn't work for woodwind. In fact, it doesn't work for any of the instruments for any of the paid-for libraries. Here's stave text for strings in Cinesamples, but no classic phrasing. And it's the same story for Berlin and Spitfire. So only the free strings and brass offer classic phrasing. That is, they interpret slurs as legato. This is a downside for the other libraries, as to emulate what is written on the score, you have to use some wacky workaround. In reality, that's too much trouble, and you keep the instrument at legato all the time. Hopefully Musesounds will sort out this shortcoming of the paid-for libraries and at the same time make classic phrasing the default. It's only a 30-second excerpt, but I don't have the stamina to enter all the legato switching, so to provide a fair-ish comparison, I'm instead going to handicap the free library by insisting it continues to play everything legato too. Of course, the exception for all orchestras is when the score says staccato. Listen out for this phrase in the cellos and basses. You'll be able to hear when a sample puts extra stress on a staccato note. So, here we go. Now we have the dynamic balance as good as we can get, we're almost ready to make judgments about the overall sound. We can listen to each section of the orchestra separately, judge its tone, intonation, and so on. To give an example, here's the pastoral snippet without strings, so you can hear the woodwind and brass briefly on their own. We can do this kind of section by section comparison across multiple test pieces, and of course go down to the instrument by instrument level too. That's the subject of the next video in this series. After that, I'll return to the pastoral snippet in yet another follow-up where the four libraries once again face off. That's all for now though. Thank you for watching and listening.